Alrighty, the first source I have is Slave Children of New Orleans. It was a newspaper article written for Harper's Weekly in New Orleans, and it was issued on January 30th, 1864, and it was written by C.C. Lee. Right around this time, slaves had just been freed, and they were now, after the ending of the Civil War, they were starting to look for jobs and ways to support their family, but a big problem was that they hadn't been educated as slaves, and so there became kind of this movement for education for slaves and like trying to create schools for them and just ways for them to learn so that they could go into society better. And so this article is just one of those things that's trying to raise awareness for that, and also like just support and also money to open up schools for slave children who had been freed, and also for some adults. So this article just gives a few biographies of freed slaves. They're mostly kids, but there are a couple adults they talk about. And one of the main things about this article is that it really focuses on slaves of mixed race, which is kind of besides the point of the article because they're trying to get education for all slave children. But the reason they focus so much on mixed race slaves is because they looked more like white kids. They looked like the normal kids to the audience, and so it made them see them more as human because they didn't seem so unfamiliar, and it focused on the fact that slavery wasn't only a matter of whether you were African American or not. It was if your mother had been a slave, then you would be too. And so the photographs that they include look like regular white kids to those readers, and so it just helps them to see them with like less of the bias that they would have and like the racism that they would have for African Americans, and it was just made them look at it twice and think more about it, and it just stayed with them more, which is a big reason why it was so widely read, because it was so shocking to people to see that and to realize that slave kids weren't normal kids and that they needed to be educated like other kids too. And so the biographies have a picture of each of them. It talks about how they look and how old they are. Most of them were like between 6 and 12 years old, but there were a couple of adults, and it tells where they were slaves and also who their masters were, which there was kind of a trend with the kids because a lot of their masters were either like their fathers or like half siblings, which was really common for kids of mixed race, that their master would also be their father, and their mother would be a slave. And then it talks about their intelligence and their schooling up to that point, because it includes slaves, like freed slaves that were really doing well in school, because it was trying to convince people that it would be worth it to have them be educated, that they were smart, and that if they were to be schooled, then they would do good in society, and that it was just worth it to raise money for that, and also awareness. And so this source was just something that stayed with people longer because it was unlike other things, because they chose a different type of group of slave children than were typically seen, which was probably a good decision on the writer's part, because it definitely had a bigger impact than most things advocating for education at that time. And that's that. The second inaugural address is my next source. It was a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave when he was reelected. He gave it in Washington, D.C. on March 4th, 1865, and it was just right before the Civil War ended. It just a couple months before, and it was only 41 days before his assassination. So at that time, the Union had done really well in the war. They were just about to win. They were in a good position. And so most people expected his address to congratulate themselves and just to celebrate like their success and like the near end of the war. But he surprises pretty much everyone by barely talking about their situation. He kind of refuses to give any predictions on what was going to happen, and he doesn't congratulate themselves at all. He more talks about the meaning and the cause of the war and just reflects on it. He calls the war God's punishment for the sin of slavery, which was both the North and South. They were both guilty of it, which was interesting because the way he spoke like that unified America. He doesn't divide the North and the South. When he talks about them, he calls it everyone's sin, and it was as the whole nation, which kind of just shows his focus as he fought that war was just preserving the Union and keeping them as one nation, which was something that was really important to him. So when he's talking, he never refers to the nation as like the Union and Confederates or the North and South. He talks about it as America as a whole. He calls it slavery of America, not slavery of the South. And he talks about how both North and South people needed to be unified, and also just to address each other as like brothers and sisters and as just like fellow people in their nation, which was uncommon for that time because they were in the middle of war where they were fighting against each other all the time. But it just shows his focus of how he wanted that to end, how he really just aimed to keep them as one nation, that he wanted the South to stay a part of America. And he calls for compassion and reconciliation, and his closing quote was, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wound, to care for him which have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphans, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." And so he was just, in that quote, telling people to have compassion for each other, and he was calling for unity between the North and the South. And then the last source I have is the essay, which is Lincoln's interpretation on the Civil War, which also just talks about the second inaugural address and a little bit about Lincoln during that time. It talks about how he opens by downplaying the significance of his re-election, saying there was no need for an extended address or discussion of the progress of our arms, because the second time he was elected, there weren't really any unknowns. They knew that the Union was probably going to win the war in the next few weeks, and the first time that he was elected, people were waiting to hear where he stood and what the plan was and how the next little while was going to play out as far as going to war. And so he's just saying it's not that significant the second time he was speaking to them after he was elected. And he refused to make any predictions, like I said before, of what would happen. And he states also in his opening that slavery was the reason for war. Even though it maybe wasn't the cause of the war, he says that slavery was a sin, and God punished them by having them go to war. And so he's talking about how God gave them the issue of slavery to solve, and that because of their weaknesses, they were only able to do it by fighting with one another, that they weren't able to resolve it peacefully. And then the essay continues to talk about how Lincoln refers to slaves as part of the population, as part of a whole, like I talked about earlier, that they were belonging with everyone else and that they were citizens just like everyone else. which also shows how he unifies the United States by not only talking about slaves and non-slaves as one, but also as the North and South as one. He talks about the nation as one. He doesn't divide it. He calls it American slavery and not Southern slavery, which, like I talked about before, makes the nation one, which was not something that people were used to at the time because they were fighting with one another. And then as the end of slavery came, in his speech he talks about what the nation should do. He questions what were the requirements of justice in the face of 250 years of unpaid labor. So he had just said slavery was a sin, so what were they supposed to do after 250 years of that? How was the nation supposed to move forward from that? And then he also asked how were they to obtain life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for the slaves. And he died shortly after, and so America never really heard what his answers to those questions were and how he was going to move forward with that in his next term. But there were questions that kind of raised awareness for like the huge task they had ahead of them to unify the whole nation after not only being at war with one another, but also having the population of slaves become part of them and no longer living as slaves. And so it was just a big question of how they were to achieve equality and unity that he talked about in his speech. The author of this essay talks about how Lincoln had been thinking a lot about reconciliation. Before he gave that speech, he had asked Governor Thomas Fletcher and military commanders in Missouri to encourage the people to abandon violence and not to look for vengeance anymore. And so the second inaugural address, what the freak? Anyway, it talks about the kind of tension between mercy for former slaveholders and justice for former slaves. So like mercy for the people who had been a part of slavery as like owners and things like that, because it had been a sin, but it was something that they were wanting to move forward from. And also justice for former slaves, because that had been such a terrible thing that had been happening to them for such a long time. He kind of talks about that balance a little bit in his speech. And it was something that was just really unique from other state speeches. Frederick Douglass called it more like a sermon than a state paper, which makes sense because Lincoln referred to God like 8 times, and he quoted and paraphrased the Bible a lot, which is, especially nowadays, something that's not common at all, because religion isn't something that plays into politics that much anymore. But it's thought that Lincoln went through sort of a spiritual awakening while he was president and fighting the war at the same time. Lincoln hadn't really belonged to a certain religion before, and so he kind of just concluded that God did intervene with the world and that he played a role in people's lives. And that kind of shows how, it reflects how, what he says in the speech, how slavery was a sin and that God had given it to them to resolve to make the nation stronger and things like that. But all around, it was just really different from other state speeches. The reaction to it was really mixed, both positive and negative. Some said it was just weird and that it didn't belong and that it just, it wasn't what they expected and they didn't like it. And then others really, really liked it. Charles Francis Adams Jr. said, "This inaugural strikes me in its grand simplicity and directness as being for all time the historical keynote of this war." So that kind of shows the reaction overall, because we're still studying the speech today because it was so timeless in the way it talked about issues that not only that not only applied to that war, but that would continue for years and years after that. Lincoln thought about it, that it wouldn't be immediately popular, but would wear well, and he said it was perhaps better than anything I have ever produced, which he knew when he wrote it that people probably wouldn't enjoy it as much because it wasn't what they expected, but that it would be something that would impact people long after the Civil War had ended, and that it would apply to other issues as well. So overall, it was just something that was really unique, and George Templeton Strong said, unlike any other state paper of this country, which just kind of shows how it was different than any other state speech that had been given up to that point. So yeah, that's all, folks.